absolutely.
So just for posterity, let me just say hello. I'm Jens. We're doing this Open Neuromorphic Hacking Hours, and with me is Alexandre Marcireau, who's a wonderful coder, and we've talked a bit about different projects, and I think agreed to work on some Faery stuff, right?
Mhm. Indeed. So the idea is just to, since Faery is still in its early stages, I think, uh, to pick one of the issues currently open and try to work through that.
Amazing. Oh, I think you froze. Alexandre, are you there?
Or look at the Rust NumPy stuff,
Sorry,
or
my
do you want to
connection
pick
just
one
froze.
of
Could you
the...
repeat like the last 10
Oh,
seconds? Sorry,
sorry.
this is like a classic. Everything is working
That's
exactly as it
absolutely
should.
all right.
Sorry,
Um,
Alexandre.
okay, so wondering what sort of issue you reckon we should start with. Uh,
Right. That's a really good question. I mean, there are some obvious ones here. So this is just a list of open issues, also for the viewers that you can check out. That lists all the issues that need help. So are tagged with needing help. So two things we talked about before is to add the continuous integration to release to PyPy. That's one thing.
mhm.
Um, Another, I think, easy thing would be to just add a documentation. That would be just a web page, like something like faery.github.io or whatever that says here is Faery. Um, but we can also have a look at the issue lists, right? So these are the open issues in the Faery. And of course, if there's something else you want to do, that's also perfectly. Now is the time.
Now, I really like the idea of the whole GitHub Actions things because it means that we have a means to monitor the progress of the thing, and we can start putting releases on PyPy. So even if it's not fully finished and polished, at least we have a path to sort of rolling releases. And in my
Amazing.
experience, that really pushes things forward. Uh,
I love that.
and
Agreed.
we can actually do that very quickly
I'm just gonna go
because,
and assign Alexander to this. Nice.
excellent. Uh, just perhaps for a bit of context on what we're doing here, so pretty much any library that is playing with low-level stuff needs to not be pure Python and usually have some sort of bit that is written in C and C++, in Rust, in some sort of low-level language. And whilst that's great for performance, that's awful for ease of use, because it means that now, in order to install your Python library, you suddenly need a compiler. Uh, and that used to be a big issue that would just make installation complicated. Uh, but since GitHub has actions, it can do that for us
Which we
free,
like.
uh,
Yeah.
which which really like. Better yet, because it can give us access to different machines, ARM, Intel, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and so on, means that we can precompile versions for all those platforms without needing access to those machines ourselves. Wouldn't be much of an issue for Linux because you can easily emulate it on different platforms, but emulating a proper Mac OS or proper Windows is always a bit of a pain.
Oh yes.
Uh, so much so, actually, that I believe that GitHub bought little Mac minis to run the
Seriously?
Apple operating system because Apple sucks. And saying that, I mean, I use an Apple machine to develop, but
But I guess
yeah,
it's not great for isolated development, right?
it is truly awful. Plus, I mean, Apple is just BSD, so it can absolutely run on other hardware, and Hackintoshes are proof of that. But Apple just want people to use something
I guess
else.
there's a business logic behind that somewhere. But I guess another
Oh,
really nice
yeah.
feature is the build matrix. You can not only do this for different systems, you could in principle also do this for different Python versions, right? Um, Oh, I can see
absolutely.
you're doing
Um,
this here. It's
yes,
amazing.
so this is copy pasted from uh, let's call it Faery 0.1, or really the version I was working on your morphic systems to bring it to a stream. Uh, well, since well here, I should probably say a few words about some of the choices in that file. Uh, if only for your, so that I'm not the only person to know why some of those decisions were made. And it'll
Perfect.
be a good exercise to make sure that I can remember what I did here. Um, okay, so first there's a bunch of rules as to when you would want to run those pipelines, and the idea is to uh, do it on, so do the build every time you make a change. So every time you push a commit, just run GitHub machines in the background, and that way, if you make a breaking change that breaks it on a machine that you cannot easily test for, earlier rather than later,
Yeah.
that the new change breaks on Windows, for instance. There is also, however, we want a bit more control than that for pushing releases to PyPy, because you can only do it once. So every time you want to do so, you have to change the version number, otherwise it breaks, which is by design. So I don't know if you've ever pushed things to PyPy. If you do, whenever you push, say, version 1.2.3, that's it. You can add more compiled binaries to that version. Say, oh, here's an extra compiled version for Windows as well, but there's no removing it or editing it,
Yeah.
which is also a security feature. Um, so it is good that it's done that way, but it can be a bit frustrating when you're on the developing end of that system. It's like, oh no, I made a little mistake, and I really don't
Exactly.
want
So if
to.
something breaks, then you have to re-upload. Then essentially you have to do a new version, right? But I
Yeah.
guess this is also
Um,
perfect here because one, it also runs on pull requests, but it also runs on releases, right? So if,
mhm.
for instance, we need to do a new version and re-upload to PyPy, I guess from GitHub, the only thing you have to do is just to create that release, and then this workflow will trigger. So that will automatically go through all the steps and then publish to PyPy, right?
That is exactly right. So
Amazing.
basically, this runs always, but it will only do the PyPy stuff if you're creating a new release. So that way you have sort of a one-to-one match between your GitHub releases and your PyPy versions. Just makes your life a little more
Beautiful.
convenient.
Beautiful.
Um, okay, so we have first some architectures. So we're using CI build wheels, which is an amazing library that does all the heavy lifting for us. Basically, it takes a Python library and then just creates a matrix of all the machines and configurations you might want and creates wheels for them. A wheel being, in Python lingo, a precompiled binary blob. So basically the same thing you would get if you were to build the Python non-Python dependencies, if that makes any sense. So all the
Mm.
C, C++, or Rust bits in the Python library that once compiled are going to be compatible with regular Python. So it's kind of magical that way. You
Yep.
can just import and it behaves like Python
As
library,
if a
but really
Python
under the
module.
hood.
Yeah,
None of that
exactly.
is Python.
That's really cool.
Um, so a wheel is just a way to share those precompiled blobs. So it also means that you want a wheel that is compatible with your operating system. And PyPy, the Python package something index, I guess, the online website that
That's actually really
lets us
good. I don't
share
know what it
that.
stands for, but yes, PyPy.
PyPy lets us share all of this.
Python package
Uh,
index. Yeah, you're right.
okay. Um, so CI build wheel lets us take the code base and generate all those wheels so that different users will be able to directly download the compiled wheel for their platform without needing a compiler themselves.
So this
So
is exactly what, like this is here where you define all the different OSs and you can
um,
run them for every, right?
not quite. So yes and no. So at the top, the environment variables define the different targets for CI build wheels. So macOS will have x86, so Intel and ARM, which are the new Apple, so-called Apple Silicon chips.
Mm.
Linux doesn't have ARM because GitHub only has better support for ARM on Linux, which is really a bit of a shame because one of the very famous Linux ARM machines is the Raspberry Pi. But as soon as they're not in beta anymore, we'll be able to add ARM to
To the
line
Linux.
12,
Right. Okay.
and that way we'll have wheels for Raspberry Pi as well. So at the moment, what happens is if you install a library on your Raspberry Pi, it will say, well, I can't find a wheel, so I'll have to download the whole source code and compile everything, which means that it will probably crash and tell you that it's missing a compiler and you'll have to install all those dependencies.
Yeah.
Not the end of the world and something we can document, but definitely not as user friendly as we want it to be.
For
But
sure. For sure.
we'll get there eventually, I think.
But I guess what
Um,
you're saying is that here then is the architectures for the different operating systems for the CI build wheel,
yeah.
and then down.
So those are kind of the
Sorry.
wheels that we're going to build.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
at the bottom, those are the GitHub machines that we are going to use.
Yeah. So this is the machines that will actually run the code. Yeah.
So the machine that will run the compilation, which will generate wheels. So Ubuntu latest is going to be in charge of generating all the Linux wheels.
And
Uh,
macOS in charge of, I guess, both the x86 and ARM.
that's Yes, that's correct. So macOS can do that, fortunately. Uh, for Windows, at the moment, CI build wheel does not have support for ARM on Windows, but since that's coming up, probably we'll need to add that at some point to the list as well.
That would be good. Yeah. Okay, but
Um,
this is already great.
okay, so uh, then we are defining what the build actually is. A lot of the build is really just installing all the dependencies.
Hmm.
So
Checking out
on
the code and installing the dependencies.
Yeah, so on macOS we need to be a bit more specific because we need to tell it to install ARM and Intel. Make sure that we have both, because otherwise we may only get one of the two
Yeah.
by default. Um, and then upload artifact here is basically some sort of shared folder within the build process where you can stash the binary blobs that you created from different parts of the system, or from different virtual machines, and then upload everything in one go when you're done.
Beautiful. And that's important because we have multiple steps, right? So I guess once this chunk of code is done, that kind of wraps everything up, and then it can continue with the next one, but we want to carry over these pre-built wheels, right?
That is absolutely correct. Um, then there is, so that would be the first step, build wheels to create those binary blobs. The second one is called import library, and that is the most minimal test that you can possibly do with a Python library, where you just make sure that it doesn't crash on import,
Mm.
which sadly happens quite often, say, if you're using types and Python 3.8. And in Python 3.8, you have to import typing and then typing.list and the name and the type in your list. Whereas for future versions of Python, it's just list without importing anything. Python's a bit of a mess sometimes. And there are workarounds for that. You can import from future, import annotations, that sort of stuff. The point is, um, quite often there are basic bugs that you will find just when you import the library. And that's very frustrating because it feels like something that would be easy to find. It's not like you found a weird edge case when you use the library in a particular way. It's really just the bare bones import. Incredibly frustrating for users as well because it feels like, wait a minute, I thought you tested this and just imported it breaks
Exactly.
immediately, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is just to have that as part of the process. Um, that said, since we have a few tests, running those tests as well, especially if they're quick, is probably not a bad idea. Um,
Definitely. Are you familiar with PyTest, the library?
I am not familiar with PyTest.
Because the way I've run now, there are some test files, and the
Hmm.
convention here is that all the test files are prefixed with test, right? And PyTest is a very nice library that goes in and filters those files. So
Hmm.
if we use PyTest, if you'd be okay with it, we could just replace this. Oh, sorry. Ah, we can replace this by a single line of code. Okay, I have to learn my commands here. Something like pytest tests,
Mhm.
and then we'll iteratively go through and find all the Python tests in there.
Oh, that's great. So anything that starts with test underscore would be treated as a Python test.
Exactly.
Oh, that's cool.
The only downside is we need the library. It's very small. I think it has minimal dependencies, but then we would have to install it here together with Wheelhouse and Faery.
Oh, yes. So we may want to do that on a second line,
Yeah. So like this.
because yes, um, the excellent. The reason is that on line 52, we want to make sure that we're installing not the existing version of Faery that is already online. We want to install the local version
Yeah.
that we just created, right? Which is not on PyPy yet, because the whole point is to run all those things before we push it there.
Excellent.
Uh, I tried to fiddle with version numbers and so on to make sure that we install local version, but it's one of those weird things where Python is just really trying to make our lives complicated. So uh, I figured that it would just be pip install and then find links, which tells Python, please use the local directory wheelhouse to resolve links.
Okay.
Also means that sometimes you can still install the online version, or there are definitely edge cases, so this is by no means perfect, but that works well enough to do like a proper test, I think.
That is amazing. I never used this flag actually, but if that works, that would be excellent because that's exactly what you want,
Um,
right?
yeah, mostly, I think.
Mostly.
Not
I mean
100.
this yeah,
Uh,
we're hacking out. We
uh,
can try it. But that means technically
yeah,
we can remove this if you're okay with it, right?
yes, absolutely. That is far more elegant, and that way we can just add more tests, and
As
we
they
don't
come, right?
risk
Yeah.
forgetting to add them here. Uh, okay, then we have built sdist. Sdist is just source, short for source distribution. And it's just basically
Hmm.
all the things that you need to put in the source, in the thing that you would download if there's no wheel available for your machine.
Yeah, so and then you have to compile it by source, which is why you need all the source files.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So arguably something that we could add, although that would make this process quite a bit more complicated, um, is to make sure that just with the sdist you can actually compile the system. It's usually easy because in principle all the Python tools kind of know which files are supposed to be included in the sdist, but there are tons of edge cases where you're actually depending on yet another external library that is in your
Hmm.
repository, but not all the data in the repository makes it into the source distribution. For instance, tests or assets, if you had some sort of example, which with a bunch of files, would not be copied over to the source distribution. That's the sort of stuff
I
that
see.
we may
Yeah.
want to test as well. Otherwise, in some cases, someone trying to compile on a Raspberry Pi will get a weird error because a file is missing, a file that is pretty important for compiling. Um,
Yeah.
and
There's a
that's
lot
hard to
of
see. Yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
yeah, and that's hard to see when you are building the wheels because the wheels get access not to the source distribution but to the entire repository. And then there's a file called the manifest that lets you specify which files you want. It's for a change, Python has a million edge cases and a million fixes to those edge cases. So
That is really the
uh,
problem, isn't it?
yeah,
But I like, I
uh,
mean, this what I like about this, right? Is basically configuration as code, right? We have everything written down in text, and we can kind of run through it step by step. And if something breaks, like we're missing a file or something happens, then I guess we will iteratively we can iteratively go through that, right?
that is absolutely right. Oh, and then there's one last bit, which is actually uploading to PyPy.
Yeah.
And this bit just takes everything in Wheelhouse and uploads it. So all this sort of process happens thanks to readily written GitHub actions. So we don't actually have to implement any of that logic
Thank you.
ourselves, which is great.
Which is the power of open
Uh,
source, by the way, right there, right?
it, yeah, oh, 100%. Um, the one thing that is showing up in yellow, at least on my machine. Yes, it's showing me yellow screen as well. Is this PyPy API token.
Yeah.
And that's something that I will add to the repository because I'm the owner of the uh, PyPy Faery repository. Well, not repository, but sort of namespace in a sense. And I need to create a new token that I will give you to the A-stream Faery repository to let that repository talk to PyPy.
So essentially, an environment variable, right, which is like the authentication token, which with this secrets.pypy we will pull in and then use when the machine actually run it. But we don't want to write it verbatim here because then all sorts of people will copy it and start uploading their own packages, right?
Exactly. And I think that touches on something pretty. Jim said that you needed to leave in 10 minutes ago. So I forgot about that.
No, in roughly 15 minutes I have to go. So I
Oh,
think
okay, got it.
we still have some time.
No worries. Easy. Um, so to briefly touch on those tokens and their importance, that has to do with so-called supply chain attacks, which is perhaps the biggest downside of open
Yes.
source and
Yeah.
one of the biggest dangers, uh, which is this whole idea of, say, you blindly depend on, um, I don't know, let's take, for example, Flask, which is a Python web server library. And in turn, Flask depends on a dozen libraries, which in turn depend on yet another dozen libraries. So it's easy to end up depending on code that you've never seen. And even the people that you trust that wrote Flask, for
Hmm.
instance, have never seen either. And usually people test and it works, and then someone uploads a new version of that low level dependency with some sort of virus, some sort of backdoor, you name it, and that can easily make it to your code. Um, and that's a hard problem, partly to the fact that the whole point of open source is that you get to benefit from, code coming from all sorts of parties. But how do you trust them? And there are definitely bad actors out there.
It's a
Uh,
really good point, right? Because you want to balance this. And I guess Python is particularly vulnerable because, I mean, Python is a powerful language. You can just access almost anything on your machine if you run arbitrary Python scripts.
Absolutely. And yeah, with uh, not a lot of, because one way around that is say, well, I've looked at the code of version 2.3. I trust version 2.3. I'm going to only use version 2.3.
Mm,
But Python doesn't make that natural in a lot of cases. It's pretty easy to just dynamically get the latest version whenever you install one. Um, so
exactly. And it's not
yeah,
like you don't have. It's at least it's hard to do stuff like checksum verification and stuff like this because in pip you can just write pip install and then if there's some malicious guy who uploaded a latest version of some package, that's what you'll get.
absolutely. So this is what that token is for. It is
Amazing.
for us to say, well, basically, here's to we guarantee that whatever gets downloaded from Faery is coming from us. Uh,
Which is why we can't write it out here verbatim, but I'm sure that's everyone will appreciate that and like it because that means they can trust whatever is going to happen in Fairy, right?
yeah. And the other one, which is, well, then again, that's this whole balancing act. Uh, One workaround is to avoid dependencies at all cost. To minimize always the number of libraries you depend on. By the same
Yes.
token, depending on libraries, great, because sometimes they solve a very complicated problem, right? Uh, so there are a few libraries out there that have very few transient dependencies, and that's usually good. Means that you don't get that library plus a million other things. You get just that library.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's the case of, for instance, NumPy. NumPy doesn't depend on anything. NumPy is just NumPy. So when you pip install NumPy, you don't also automatically pip install a million other things. You just pip install NumPy. That is great.
It's
And that's,
amazing. Yeah.
I mean, arguably could be part of the standard library. It's that
By
useful, right?
now, yeah, it's NumPy is pretty much
Uh,
everywhere. At least if you're us, I guess.
yeah.
Um,
Uh,
but
and yeah,
mhm.
yeah,
Well, I mean, I wonder, like, this is actually, I mean, of course, we can dive more into all the details and understand everything. I think yes, maybe one point to highlight here is that there's this very important if statement here, right? Because obviously we only want to put to PyPy once it's released, right? Because it was run not only on releases but also on pull requests and pushes. So that means that we can safely run this now, maybe also in a pull request, just to see whether it works or not. What do you think about that?
that is a very good idea. Um,
Because in
so
principle, this should work, right? Famous last words,
yes.
but yeah.
So what I'm going to do, because I fully expect to have to iterate quite a lot, and it's one of those things where the only way to really test it is to actually push commits.
That's the problem with actions. I agree.
Yeah.
There's this
Um,
act. Have you heard about that?
I have not.
So there is
Have not.
someone who tried to build a virtual environment for running actions locally. I'm not sure. Let me put it on
So
Discord here.
since we don't have any restrictions to only building stuff pushed on main, I'm just going to create a branch, push to that branch.
Yeah, I think that's
So,
that's yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess we could just push it to main, but I guess the value of having a branch is that you can iterate on the actions, like you said, right? So we can test it there before.
and in the meantime, I'm going to add that a key,
Amazing.
create a
You are
token for
fast. You already made the
Faery.
branch. Amazing. Uh-oh.
Oh, I'm. Is something broken
There
already?
is a failure in the build. Failed to get NumPy as a depend. Ooh. Yes. Do you remember the issue with NumPy 2.0 and Rust?
I do. Actually, there's been progress on.
Ah, fantastic.
Uh, there's been progress on that. In that, I haven't done much myself, but people have been talking about that update. So hopefully soon we'll be able to address that.
Amazing. Uh, and I guess
Uh,
the challenge here quickly is that we depend on NumPy 2, but because we're using Rust, the bindings to NumPy 2 is still uh, missing. Is that a correct description?
uh, so that should work. So I'm not quite sure.
Well, the reason here is so now we are depending on NumPy, and here we're using the path to Rust to NumPy, which is going to be a problem for most people. I guess what we could do is to not only check out the code that we have, but also check out the submodules, because that should check out this Rust NumPy until the Rust NumPy, because now we have a local version of Rust NumPy, right? And then at some point, what you're saying is that will be published, and then once it's published, we can rely on that.
Yes. So Rust NumPy here, that little token, is really in reference to the bit of Rust that is going to give NumPy compatibility to the library.
Yeah,
So that gets baked in, and whether we import it from an external library in Rust or whether we use a local directory, at least for anyone using wheels, it's not going to make any difference. It's going to end up baked into the binary blob either way. The issue, if we don't do that at the moment, is that the current version of Rust NumPy, the online version, uh, is only compatible with NumPy 1. So
yeah,
if you happen to have NumPy 2 on your machine when you install Faery, bad things are going to happen at the worst time, which is at runtime when you have no clue what's going on and
yeah.
you just get weird seg faults at random times, which we want to
We
avoid.
we really don't
Uh,
like that. Yeah,
yeah, very bad in C or C++, just impossible to deal with in Python because you have no clue as to where that problem could be coming from. Uh, So I'm quite surprised that we're running into an issue here. I was expecting issues uh, at runtime, not during compilation. Let's have a look.
I fully see that. I guess maybe we can be a bit more specific about the error messages. There are two problems here. One thing is in the build wheels task. I don't know what we have. That's the first task. Maybe we should start there actually. And here the problem is that when we try to run the pip wheel with no depths, then it fails to load source for dependency numpy. It failed to get numpy as dependency. And I guess that would be because it exactly doesn't find the submodule. Or what's your interpretation here? Because it's unable to update project rust numpys. That must be the subfolder. So doesn't that just mean that we have checked out the repository, we haven't checked out the submodules? So
Oh, it's a submodule.
here we have
I thought
the
that we made is it a submodule or is it a full copy?
it's a submodule.
Oh, that is why I reckon that you're right. Um,
So we'd have to check that out. And I guess what's the syntax for that? Do you remember?
I do not. I've seen that problem before. Just
Maybe
before
Copilot.
that.
Oh wait, let me see. Find it here. Yeah. So what you can do is you can say
With submodules true. Yep.
sorry.
Yep.
I think that should do it, right? But this is also needed when we do the import library, right? Because we have the same, um, right? When we no, not import library. Sorry, when we build the sdist, right? Then we also rely on the local Rust numpy version, right?
Um,
So there's
let's
also
see.
the error here in the GitHub Actions.
Yeah.
We can see.
So that's probably going to break anyway, because I don't think that Python will know that the directory Rust NumPy uh, is something that it should include in the source distribution. It's going to assume that some sort of test directory or something. That's probably not going to include it unless we add it to the manifest. Uh, that said, we could decide that at least for the time being, we wash our hands with the source distribution.
That's a
Partly
possibility.
because that's going to be fixed soon.
Let's do that. So you by washing hands, I mean you just want to
So
comment it out.
we can leave it there. It's just that whatever gets baked into that .tar.gz is not going to be enough to actually build anything. So Faery is not going to be
Hmm.
compatible with Raspberry Pis
Yeah,
short term.
for now. I guess we can
Probably live with that.
for now. Although I do like Raspberry Pis. I have to say they're a pretty cool platform. Um,
Don't get me wrong. The goal is absolutely to support them. Uh, I'm just thinking that for the yeah.
no,
Uh,
I fully agree. It's definitely about getting it done. But if you agree with the
right.
changes, are there anything else we need
Mhm.
to be doing, or
Only
can we
one way
try
to find
to?
out. I'm gonna push that and see what that gives us. Let's see. That's
I'm eagerly standing
submodule.
by here. I also have to say the GitHub page here is just really really nice. I think it even auto updates and just shows things very very nicely. So even though you have to run it remotely, it seems simple because you also have these debug stages, right? We can click on the task now it's running. You can see exactly what is going wrong and what's going right.
Absolutely.
Um,
Yes, it is. I think it's a little better than the GitLab equivalent, which is okay, but slightly less smooth.
And then the next iteration we can use NixOS for this, right?
Um,
That's a very
I've
inside joke.
actually, I know, look, I've actually suggested it for Astrocyte. We probably mentioned it during
Ooh.
Telluride, this whole container system, because inside it, at the moment, we have machines that we manually set up every time. And when one breaks, we just cry a lot and
Oh
spend the next
no.
2 days
Oh
trying to figure out
no.
what's going on.
Yeah, that is painful.
Uh, and it's got like Redis in a particular version, all running in a particular version of the operating system with all sorts of network modifications to reroute certain things and so on. It's a mess. It is really a mess. And right now, I just don't want to update the hardware because I know that it's going to be 2 days of painful in trying to replicate all those changes.
Oh god.
And that sounds like the right job for NixOS, right? That's kind of what it's for.
Totally. Totally. I mean, and I think that's completely true, right? I will also have to preface that I am evangelizing NixOS because I just really, really like it, but it doesn't mean that it solves everything. I mean, containers is also one way to get around things like that, right? Um,
I'm all for, pushing things we like and
Well, I mean,
uh,
it's like some kind of religions, or even I think people also mention that for vegans or vegetarians, even though I think that might be not so true anymore. But the fact that people just really care about something, it's like if I believe my friend will burn in hell for all eternity, I should probably also do a bit something
yeah,
to convert
that's
them, right?
that's fair enough.
Um, but
And
look
it
at this
is worth
green
mentioning.
check mark
All
here.
right.
This is amazing.
Excellent. Yeah, that one's easy usually. That's the one that always works because it's really just zipping a directory.
It is, but I think the reason why it crashed before is because it's actually running Maturin, right? So it's running the Rust crate somehow
Um,
for the S
Sort of.
test.
So Maturin is written in Rust, but it's really just a tool to zip things.
Mm, fair.
It
Okay.
is
So
very
maybe just
similar
because the
to
Rust, maybe just because it read the cargo file and then it saw that the Rust NumPy directory existed, and then it,
yes,
yeah,
I think
that
that's
makes
correct.
sense. And so then we come
Um,
back to your point, which means that if anyone tries to build this, they're gonna fail because they don't have it. But it doesn't really, like you say, we can
yeah.
look into that later probably.
All right. Oh, so
We have
it
a second check mark.
seems to
Oh
be
my god.
working happily so far. So it's been able to compile everything. Um, so in non-Rust Python extensions, the perhaps most standard tool is called, I forgot. Um, there's a uh, set of tools.
Ah, yes. Oh god,
The
the
set
setup
of
tools.
tools is an absolute monstrosity, but your de facto standard if you're compiling a C or C++ extension,
Oh yeah.
unless you're using another form of extension, because there's like at least three ways of extending Python with lower level code. So it is, yeah, complicated for a change.
Yeah. I suffered that for A stream a lot, I can tell you, and I know you have too. Um, so I mean, also maybe one nice thing of going with Rust. I'm not saying that's the only redeeming factor, but one nice thing is that you start from a clean slate, right? You don't have all this legacy you have to maintain. You can just pick all the sane choices and remove all the insane choices, and that already saves you, at least saves us, I think, a lot of time.
It really does. And honestly, like Rust is an interesting language. It's got a few very cool features that I like, but every language has a few cool features where it's like, hey, look, if you're doing this one thing, the language is really well suited to that. It's really nice to work with. But really, what makes it much nicer than C or C++ is the ecosystem. It's and then again, not because it's fundamentally better, though it is, but because it's 20 years younger.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, all the mistakes were made in the past, and it is now much nicer to use.
But I
Um,
think I think that's a really really important point, right? Because also the people who were working on this 20 years ago, I don't think they were necessarily dumber than us, right? So the only benefit we have is like this history essentially, right? That we can see what worked in the past and we can try to draw some lessons from this, right? But we still make a lot of mistakes. So
Oh
I
yeah.
think it's a really important point to say that we can use modern tools because they are historically more experienced, but they might not necessarily be better, right? I mean, like some of the old Makefile tools or old Unix tools are still actually pretty good. Wow, look at this.
All right.
This is going
Yeah.
fantastically smooth.
Um, so one sort of downside of the way it's currently written, it will build for every single platform and then run the next step, which is trying to import the compile libraries on every single platform. So it's kind of waiting for everyone to finish and then doing the rest. So quite often you have to wait for whichever is the slowest to finish building, only to realize that there's a stupid mistake and that as soon as you import the library, something crashes because you forgot to import something.
Yep.
Uh, but I mean, that's what those tests are for. And
Yeah,
yeah,
so I guess you could set it up in parallel. So you had like a Windows workflow and a Mac workflow and so on and so forth. I guess
that'd
one
be the
one
right way to do
benefit,
it.
yeah, but I guess one benefit here is that this doesn't run on our machine, right? In principle, we can walk away and take a cup of coffee right now if you wanted to, and like once we have this workflow done, hopefully, it won't break too much because the tests, hopefully, will make sure locally we can make sure this is a relatively
Absolutely. And really especially if you're working on because just one word on Faery, has two sides, right? There's the low level stuff,
yeah, the Rust
uh,
stuff.
written in Rust, and then there's the higher level stuff written in Python. And in principle, Python is fairly consistent across platforms. If it works well on your machine, unless you're doing witchcraft, there's no reason for your Python code not to work somewhere
Exactly.
else. Uh, Rust, on the other hand, even though is better than C or C++ in this regard, still sometimes behaves in a slightly different way on different systems. And really, those tests are first and foremost for that part of the system, right?
Yeah.
Uh, make sure that whenever we change, and yeah, so yeah, for anyone seeing this and thinking, oh, that sounds very difficult, for all the Python stuff, this should mostly be just a quick check. But if it worked on your machine, it should still work once on.
This is amazing. I will unfortunately have to slowly end my stream at least because I have to run. But I must admit I'm positively surprised how much you managed to do, and at least now we have 3 out of 4 green check marks. Alexander, I really want to thank you for dropping by. Like, if anyone looking at this doesn't really know you, like they should really check you out because you've done an amazing amount of work, especially for space and event camera application, including reverse engineering drivers for event cameras, which is an absolutely mind-boggling and incredible technical feat. So I'll put this up on YouTube and link to your profile and I recommend people checking it out. But thank you so much for joining. I hope we can hang out like this again. I mean, with this amount of success, this is amazing. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, very keen to be here next week as well. And um, let's try and turn this into a habit.
Right? Amazing. Yeah. I'm gonna stop the
All right.
recording.